Book China's 40 Years of Reform and Development 1978 to 2018. Edited by Ross Garnott, Li Gongsong, and Cai Feng. Chapter 1. 40 Years of China's Economic Reform and Development. Discusses China's economic reform and opening up over the past 40 years. Provides data on trade and growth experiences. Sketches key elements of reform, changes in incentives driving growth, and changes in economic structure. Highlights China's rising role in the global economy. Introduces the 11th Central Committee's shift from political movement to economic development. Highlights the first break in the planned economy in 1978. Introduces shift from central planning to market exchange. China's reform and opening up policy. Deng Xiaoping led China's two-decade reform and opening up policy. In 1979, China established special export zones, SEZs, in Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Shantou, and Xiamen. Expansion of the experiment extended to 14 coastal cities, Hainan Province, and Yangtze River cities. China resumed its status as a contracting party to GATT and WTO in 1986 and 2001 respectively. Over 40 years, China's reforms have led to socio-economic change and institutional innovation. Expected to deliver high-income status by early 2020s if reform momentum remains. The chapter explores China's missed opportunity to catch up with developed countries, economic growth enhancement, and new growth approaches. China's planning era, missed opportunity of convergence. In 1980, China ranked low in gross national income per capita but high in human capital indices and life expectancy. Despite low income, China had strong capacity to mobilize capital with an average investment rate of 29.5% from 1953 to 78. The planned economy lacked institutional conditions for efficient resource allocation and work incentives, leading to inefficiency. High capital accumulation and rapid labor force increases did not lead to economic growth due to low productivity and resource misallocation. Appropriate technology was not applied in economic activity. China transitioned from a high birth rate to a dual economy with a labor surplus in agriculture. China's economic strategy and development. Adopted a comparative advantage following strategy to promote industrialization. System comprised of macro policy environment, planned resource allocation, and micromanagement institutions. Macro policy environment prioritized heavy industry for capital accumulation and industrialization. Industrial structure deviated from China's comparative advantage, with disproportionate output allocated to investment. Centralized planning system led to supply-demand imbalance and resource allocation failure. Micromanagement institutions operated inefficiently, contributing to decline in total factor productivity. Economic isolation from world economy, with GDP share of exports and imports at 9.7% in 1978. China's per capita GDP and resource allocation. In 1952, China's GDP was $538, below world averages. By 1978, GDP dropped to 6.8%, 42.1%, and 22.1%. Inefficient resource allocation due to planned economy. Population dependency ratio fell in mid-1960s, reducing younger workers. Lewis model suggests abundant labor maintains high savings rate and increases efficiency. Planning model prevented these benefits, with agricultural labor share remaining at 74.5%. Decline in total factor product slowed growth by 72%. Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution contributed to underperformance. Impact of reform and opening up in China. Conditions for economic reform. Benefits should be provided to a major group for political support. Benefits should not be at the expense of other substantial groups. The reform should start in a key area to transmit momentum. Early reforms in rural China. Introduction of the Human Resource System, HRS, and abolition of people's communes met these conditions. By 1984, all production brigades and 98% of households adopted the HRS. The reform improved incentives for agricultural production by granting farmers autonomy over operations and rights to profits. Impact of reforms. Between 1978 to 84, grain yield per unit area increased by 42.8%, total output of grain increased by 36.6%, and real agricultural value added increased by 52.6%. The nominal average income of farm households increased by 166%. The number of rural residents living in absolute poverty dropped from 250 million to 128 million. China's urban reform and SO reform. SO reform aimed to make SOs market players. Autonomy was granted to SOs in the late 1970s, expanded to regions, and eventually the entire country in the early 1980s. In the late 1990s, a radical measure was introduced, corporatizing large SOs and privatizing small and medium-sized enterprises. State-owned Assets Administration and Reform in China. Established in 1988, renamed the State-Owned Assets Supervision and Administration Commission, SASUC, in 2003. SASUC supervises central government's non-financial state enterprises. Similar organizations were established at the local level to supervise state assets owned by local governments. Introduction and encouragement of non-state enterprises. Property rights and governance structures were reformed to allow a wider range of non-state enterprises. Competition between enterprises with different ownership forms and mixed ownership increased efficiency of state-owned enterprises, SOEs. In 2015, only 4.1% of businesses with annual revenue of RMB 20 million or more were registered as SOEs. Increased importance of price rightness. Profit-based incentives have increased the importance of getting prices right. Enterprise reform requires effective markets for setting prices for factors of production, goods, and services. Transformation of government roles. The overall direction is to transform central and local governments from direct involvement in economic activities to promoting equity and broadly based development through basic public services. China's international economic growth and demographic dividend. China's international economic expansion has been facilitated by expanding imports and exports, attracting foreign investment, and participating in global governance. The demographic dividend, where the working age population's growth surpasses that of the dependent population, has driven China's high growth rate and high savings rate. Despite the demographic dividend, returns to capital have remained high during China's reform period, but have diminished after the Lewis turning point characterized by labor shortage and wage inflation. The abundant labor supply and favorable age structure of the population aid in the improvement of human capital in less developed countries. Labor inputs contribute to GDP growth at 17%, 8%, and 4% respectively. Labor mobility and total factor productivity growth in China. Labor mobility significantly contributes to total factor productivity, TFP, growth. The World Bank, 1998, divided TFP growth in China into increased intersectoral efficiency and a residual. The outstanding performance of the Chinese economy has been the result of reform and opening up, with potential GDP growth rates of 9.7% in 1979 to 95 and 10.4% in 1997 to 2010. Strong employment growth spreads the improvement in living standards. China's economic transformation and demographic dividend. Key factors influencing China's economic growth. Rapid wage rate increase since the Lewis turning point, 2004 to 2016. Redistribution policy intensification, including poverty alleviation programs, public service coverage expansion, and raising minimum wages. Systemic transitions. China transitioned from a planned to a market economy and from a dual economy to neoclassical growth. Rapid demographic transition from high to low fertility facilitated by economic reform and global economy opening. Growth factors and implications. Capital accumulation, labor quantity, human capital, technology, and population factor contribute to economic growth. Investment and net exports initially disproportionately contributed to economic growth. Shift from labor and capital supply to productivity enhancement. China needs to shift from labor and capital supply increases to productivity enhancement. China's potential growth rate. Potential growth rate fell from 10% per annum prior to 2010 to 7.6% in the 12th five-year plan, 2011 to 15, and 6.2% in the 13th five-year plan, 2016 to 20. Deeper reform and economic growth. Deeper reform is crucial for future economic growth, but it's challenging to find improvements that benefit all groups without harming others. Reform faces resistance and interference from vested interests. The creative destruction necessary for growth may lead to job loss and enterprise disappearance. To address these challenges, the reform dividend should be made available to the losers of reform. Successful reform requires political wisdom and determination. Future TFP growth will largely come from innovation and Schumpeterian creative destruction. Deepening reforms to increase competition, break monopolies, encourage entrepreneurial activities, and strengthen social protection is required.